6:42 on a Tuesday morning, Marcus opens his phone to make a call. He has 351 connections on LinkedIn. He does not know who to call. Somewhere in that list is the person who could get him into a room he needs to be in this week, and he cannot find them because nothing in that list was built to survive a moment like this one. This is not a story about being unfriendly. Marcus has a mortgage, 2 kids, and 11 years of strong performance reviews behind him. What he does not have is a network with any financial function, and there is a measurable difference between a contact list and an asset. Over the next few minutes, that difference gets priced in weeks, in dollars, and in the exact moment most people discover they never built it. Most people in Marcus's position believe they have already covered this base. The logic feels complete. Build the emergency current. Stay excellent at the job itself, because excellence is what gets rewarded and everything else is politics. Relationships, in this framing, sit in a separate category from finance entirely, filed next to hobbies and holidays, something warm and voluntary rather than something load-bearing. A financial plan has line items for savings rate, for insurance, for retirement contributions. It does not have a line item for how many people would take a call at 9 at night. That omission feels correct because the architecture of most personal finance advice treats the household as a closed system, one income, one balance sheet, one set of decisions made in isolation from other people entirely. Under that architecture, a strong network is a nice-to-have, a soft asset, the kind of thing mentioned in a job interview, but never listed next to a 401k balance. Marcus would have told you, a year before that Tuesday morning, that his financial position was sound. Savings covered 8 months of expenses. Retirement contributions were on schedule. Insurance was in order. He had done everything the framework asked of him. What the framework never asked him to measure was who, exactly, was standing near him when the one variable he could not control finally moved. This isn't a personal failing specific to Marcus. It's the default output of how personal finance gets taught, modeled, and sold. A spreadsheet-shaped discipline built around numbers that can be tracked in an app, income, expenses, contribution percentages, interest rates. A relationship doesn't fit a cell. It can't be automated into a recurring transfer, so it gets treated as though it doesn't belong on the same ledger as the things that can. The comfort here is real and, on its own terms, reasonable. Marcus wasn't reckless. He optimized precisely the variables he'd been told mattered, and by every conventional measure available to him, he was ahead of most people his age. Here is the crack. 2 employees, same title, same tenure, same performance rating, get laid off from the same company in the same week. One has a new role within 5 weeks at a higher salary than before. The other takes 7 months, and the offer that finally arrives pays $27,000 less than the old one. Same resume quality, same interview skill, same market conditions. The difference did not show up on either person's LinkedIn profile because a follower count and a functioning network are not the same instrument, and most people cannot tell the two apart until the moment they need one of them to actually work. The hidden job market is not a myth built to sell networking courses. Industry hiring data consistently shows that a large share of open roles never reach a public job board at all, filled instead through referral and direct outreach before the listing exists. Referred candidates get interviewed and hired at several multiples of the rate non-referred applicants do, and they tend to close faster once they're in the process. None of that shows up in a savings account balance. None of it shows up on a resume, no matter how well it's written. It shows up exactly once, at the worst possible moment, when a person finds out which category of asset they actually built over the preceding decade. The uncomfortable part isn't that connections matter. Most people would nod along to that much. The uncomfortable part is the asymmetry in when the bill comes due. A savings account tells you its balance every day. A network tells you nothing until the day you try to withdraw from it, and on that day it either performs or it doesn't, with no partial credit for good intentions, and no do-over if the answer is no. 2 people can believe, right up until the moment of the layoff, that they've built roughly the same thing. Only one of them actually has. The mechanism has a name in the research literature, though almost nobody encounters it outside a graduate sociology seminar. It's called a structural hole, a term developed by the sociologist Ronald Burt to describe the gap between two people or two groups who hold complementary information but have no direct connection between them. Burt's finding, replicated across decades of organizational research, was that people whose networks span these gaps get systematically better outcomes than people whose networks don't, regardless of raw talent. Their ideas get evaluated as more valuable inside their own organizations. Their compensation runs higher. Their promotions come faster. Not because they are smarter than the people around them, but because they occupy a position in the structure of relationships that lets information, opportunity, and trust move through them before it moves through anyone else. A related and earlier finding from the sociologist Mark Granovetter showed that the people most likely to hand someone a genuine opportunity are rarely their closest friends. Their weak ties, the former colleague, the person from a conference 2 years ago, the neighbor who works in an adjacent industry, because close friends already share the same information and the same job leads. Weak ties are the ones standing in a different room, holding something a close circle can't. That's the origin. The current form is less academic and considerably more profitable. Somewhere between the publication of that research and today, the concept of a professional network got absorbed into platforms built to monetize the appearance of connection rather than the function of it. A follower count is not a structural hole. A list of 341 names not spoken to in years is not weak tie infrastructure. It's an address book that decays the moment maintenance stops, and stopping is the default, because maintenance requires time, and time is the one resource every high performer has already allocated somewhere else. The platforms profit specifically from this gap between appearance and function. Engagement metrics reward posting, liking, and commenting, all of which are visible and countable, while the actual maintenance behavior that produces a usable weak tie, an occasional unscheduled coffee, a check-in with nothing to ask for, is invisible to any algorithm and generates no revenue for anyone. Meanwhile, on the employer side, referral programs quietly transferred the cost of recruiting onto employees. A company that fills a role through employee referral spends less on sourcing, screens faster, and gets a candidate pre-vetted by someone already inside its trust structure at a fraction of what an external search firm would charge. That savings is real, and it is captured almost entirely by the employer. The employee who made the referral typically receives a bonus worth a few hundred to a few $1,000s. The infrastructure that produced the referral, years of unpaid relationship maintenance built on personal time, produced value that was never priced on anyone's balance sheet and never returned in full to the person who built it. The revenue model underneath this is straightforward once it's named. A professional networking platform makes money primarily by selling visibility back to the people who already have real access, recruiter seats, premium messaging tiers, promoted posts, priced highest for the users who need them least, because a well-positioned hiring manager or executive already has functioning weak ties and is paying mostly to move faster, while a person without that positioning pays the same subscription price for a tool that can't manufacture the years of trust a real weak tie requires. The platform's incentive is for everyone to feel underconnected enough to keep paying, not for anyone to actually close the gap Burt described, because closing it would shrink the market for the subscription. There's a second-order effect that compounds the first one. Because relationship maintenance is unpaid, invisible to performance reviews, and competes directly with the hours that do get measured and rewarded, it gets treated as the first thing to cut whenever a person is under pressure at work, which is precisely the population most exposed to layoffs, reorganizations, and the kind of sudden income shock this mechanism exists to buffer against. The people with the least slack to build the asset are systematically the people who need it soonest. And because access to this kind of network correlates heavily with education, industry, and geography, the gap doesn't just separate individuals, It separates entire cohorts. A worker in a role with fewer weak-tie industry contacts, to begin with, faces the same layoff risk with a thinner buffer, which is one reason downturns hit some households as a brief inconvenience and others as a structural collapse, despite comparable savings rates going in. One detail here is worth holding on to because it resurfaces later. The reason this asset stays invisible on a personal financial statement isn't an accident of financial planning convention. It's downstream of a cultural story that treats self-reliance as the only respectable financial posture, one where needing other people reads as weakness to be minimized rather than a position to be engineered on purpose. That story didn't originate with any single company or platform, but it is extremely convenient for several of them at once, and exactly whose interest that convenience serves is worth naming before this ends. The two people in this scenario are composite illustrations built from aggregate hiring, layoff, and job search data rather than any single documented individual constructed to make one variable visible against an otherwise identical starting point. Marcus and Devin, both 39, both senior engineering managers at the same mid-size software company in Austin, both earning a base salary of $165,000 a year, were laid off in the same reduction event in the same week for the same stated reason: the division they managed was being consolidated. Their performance reviews going back 5 years were nearly identical, both rated strong, dependable, promotable. Neither had been job hunting, neither saw it coming. Marcus is married, 2 kids, a mortgage payment of $3,100 a month. Devin is married with 1 child, renting, with a comparable monthly housing cost and a similar overall expense load. So the 2 households entered the layoff with roughly equivalent financial exposure on paper, which is precisely what makes the divergence that followed a clean test of the one variable that wasn't equivalent. The variable that diverged started 6 years earlier. Marcus had built a standing habit of 1 coffee or lunch a month with someone outside his current company, a former colleague, someone he'd mentored who had since moved on, an occasional contact from an industry meetup he attended twice a year. Over 6 years, that's roughly 72 touch points, unglamorous, mostly unremarkable 30-minute conversations that produced no visible return at the time they happened. Devin, equally capable and equally well-regarded, spent that same 6 years the way most high performers are trained, heads down, protecting focus, treating time outside the job as recovery rather than infrastructure. Neither man would have described himself, before the layoff, as having made a deliberate networking decision at all. It didn't feel like a decision in the moment. It felt like a personality difference. The morning both received notice, Marcus texted 3 former colleagues. 2 responded within hours. 1 knew of an open role that hadn't been posted publicly yet at a company midway through a hiring push and made an introduction that same day. 12 days later, Marcus was in a final round interview. 5 weeks after the layoff, he signed an offer at $172,000, a raise over his previous salary. His named emotional state moved from controlled urgency in week 1 to something closer to relief by week 4. Devin applied to 340 postings for the following 7 months, 6 first-round interviews, 1 final round that didn't convert. The offer that eventually arrived, in 7s, was $138,000, a $27,000 cut, and a step down in title from what he'd held before. Over that search, he drew down $41,000 in savings. His named emotional state by month 5 was a quiet flattening, not panic exactly, closer to the specific fatigue of submitting application number 200 with no more information than application number 1 had given him. Neither man's talent explains the gap. Both had it, in comparable measure, by every metric their employer tracked. What diverged was 6 years of 30-minute investments that neither one had priced as financial behavior at the time. And by the time the divergence became visible, it was too late in the crisis to build the version of the asset that would have actually helped. Devin has since started rebuilding aggressively, reaching out to old contacts on a weekly schedule now. Whether that repair holds once the acute anxiety of the search fades or fades itself the moment a paycheck resumes is, honestly, still an open question. What the two timelines share is a starting balance sheet that looked identical to any lender, any advisor, any spreadsheet built around income, savings rate, and debt. The instrument that actually separated a 5-week search from a 7-month one never appeared on either man's financial statement, not because it was hidden, but because nobody had built a place to record it. Scale this beyond 2 composite cases and the pattern holds at a population level, moving in a direction that makes the mechanism more consequential with each passing year rather than less. Time use data collected by the U.S. Census Bureau's American Time Use Survey shows that Americans spent about 60 minutes a day with friends 2 decades ago. By 2023, that number had fallen to 26 minutes a day, a decline that shows up across every age group and is steepest among people in their teens and 20s, the exact years when weak tie infrastructure would normally start getting built. Separate survey research puts the share of Americans reporting 0 close friends at roughly 3% in 1990, rising to somewhere around 17% by the mid-2020s. Bureau of Labor Statistics time use data from 2024 put the average American's daily time spent alone at around 6 hours and 40 minutes. Now model a hypothetical cohort, purely illustrative and not drawn from any tracked group. 10,000 mid-career professionals entering a recession-driven layoff wave, carrying the network maintenance habits typical of today's declining trendline rather than the trend line of 20 years ago. If the referral hire advantage documented in current hiring data holds at scale, and if the compensation and promotion premium Burt's structural holes research found for well-positioned networks holds at scale, a meaningfully larger share of that hypothetical cohort lands in something closer to Devin's outcome than Marcus's, not because the group got less talented over those 20 years, but because the collective infrastructure available to catch them thinned out while nobody was pricing it as an asset worth defending. The gap is not evenly distributed even within that decline. Survey data from the mid-2020s shows a widening split by education level in who reports having no close friends at all, with people holding a high school education or less roughly twice as likely to report 0 close friends as college graduates, a gap that barely existed a generation earlier. That split matters financially because it tracks almost exactly onto who has access to the kind of industry-spanning weak ties that produce a referral, meaning the erosion in social connection is not just shrinking everyone's buffer equally, it's shrinking it fastest for the households that already carry the least other cushion. The public health framing of this trend treats it as a well-being issue, and it is one. A widely cited meta-analysis comparing mortality risk found that chronic social disconnection carries a health cost in the same range as smoking a moderate number of cigarettes a day. What that framing tends to leave out is the financial half of the same mechanism. The people most exposed by this trend line are not the unemployed or the very young. They're the ones who currently look safest, high earners in stable roles who have every conventional financial box checked except this one, because a strong salary and a demanding job are exactly the conditions under which relationship maintenance feels most optional, and optional is the first thing cut when a calendar fills up. Redefine the term before going further, because network, as most people use the word, describes the wrong instrument entirely. A network, in the sense Burt's and Granovetter's research points toward, is not a popularity measure or an extroversion trait. It functions closer to a diversified position, a set of weak ties spread across companies, industries, and geographies that don't move in correlation with each other, so that if one source of income or information fails, the others remain independently intact. Judged this way, a network carries the same properties any financial asset carries. It has a maintenance cost, roughly the 30 minutes a month Marcus spent and Devin didn't. It has a liquidity profile, meaning how fast it converts into an actual opportunity at the moment one is needed. And it has a correlation risk, meaning a network built entirely inside one company or one friend group behaves like an undiversified portfolio, all of it moving in the same direction at the same time, which is exactly the wrong structure for the moment a single employer's decision removes an entire household's income. None of this requires becoming a different kind of person, more social, more outgoing, more comfortable working a room. Marcus wasn't any of those things. He made one recurring calendar entry and kept it for 6 years, which looks less like a personality trait and more like an unglamorous, automated contribution, the same structural habit that makes a retirement account work, regardless of how a person feels about investing on any given month. This is also where the individualism story from earlier in this analysis gets its costs itemized. The cultural instruction to be self-sufficient, to build a career on merit and savings alone, to treat needing other people as an admission of insufficient planning produces exactly the maintenance gap that shows up in the data as declining time spent with friends and rising numbers of people with no close ties at all. That instruction isn't neutral. It suppresses an asset class that doesn't show up on anyone's balance sheet, while the platforms and employers positioned to benefit from an underbuilt personal network face none of the downside when it fails to hold. Treating relationship maintenance as a scheduled allocation rather than a personality trait doesn't require becoming someone else. It requires pricing something that was already there all along, correctly, before the day it's needed rather than after the day it wasn't. Liquidity isn't only what sits in a brokerage account or a savings account. It's who picks up the phone when the call comes and how fast they do it. If income stopped tomorrow, how many calls would it take before someone said yes? And when was the last time one of those calls got made for no reason at all, before anything was needed back? Social capital as a financial buffer is one of the most under-discussed mechanisms in wealth preservation, especially in the exact moment when every other mechanism fails.